The alarm on my console blinked red before I even sat down. My name is Clara Bennett, and 3 minutes ago I was drinking cold coffee in a hallway. Now I was standing in front of a screen that made no sense, in a room full of aliens who were staring at me like I had grown a second head. The Interstellar Compliance Bureau does not like surprises. Everything about the DNA trials program is built to remove surprises. Every species that wants a seat at the Concord table has to walk through this process. We take a sample. We run it through the scanner. We measure something called an aggression signature, which sounds simple, but it decides how the galaxy treats you for the next 100 years. Too aggressive, and you get watched, contained, restricted. Too passive, and you get ignored, pushed around, sometimes swallowed whole by species that smell weakness, the way sharks smell blood in water. Humanity had just been granted provisional membership, not full rights, not yet. We were the new species on the block, and everyone in this building was quietly certain we would land somewhere near the bottom of the chart. Short lives, constant infighting, no shared language even on our own homeworld. The joke going around the science wing was that humans couldn't agree on what to have for lunch, let alone pose a threat to anyone. I had heard that joke from 3 different officials in the past 2 days. I had laughed along with it because it was easier than arguing. Then the results came back, and nobody was laughing anymore. The room around me held 6 people. Well, 6 beings, if I am being accurate. 2 bureau officials from a species that looked like tall insects wrapped in silver robes. 1 data technician, a small round creature named Io, who communicated mostly through a translator box clipped to her collar, and 2 Warborn. I should explain what the Warborn are, because if you don't understand them, you won't understand why that red alarm made my stomach drop the way it did. The Warborn are the oldest fighting culture in known space. Centuries ago, their ancestors made a choice. They decided that survival meant being the best at one single thing, and they bred themselves toward it with the same discipline other species use to grow crops or build cities. Every child born into their culture inherits a nervous system tuned for combat. Every one of them carries what the Bureau calls a pure aggression signature, clean, predictable, terrifying in its simplicity. The 2 Warborn in the room that day were named Threk Von and Korath. Threk Von was older, quieter, with pale gray markings along his jaw that meant he held some kind of command rank. Korath was younger, broader, restless in the way soldiers get when they have spent too much time standing still. Threk Von had leaned toward me earlier that morning, before any of this happened, and said something I did not understand until much later. He said, "Trials have a way of finding what a species tries to hide from itself." I had smiled politely and said something about hoping the tests went smoothly. I did not know yet that he was warning me. The Warborn had already completed their portion of the trial. Their results came back exactly the way everyone expected. 1 signature, sharp, focused, a single blade of behavior, honed across generations. The technicians barely glanced at it before filing it away. It was the baseline. It was the standard against which every other species in this galaxy gets measured, because nothing else out there fights the way the Warborn do. Then it was our turn. The human volunteers had been selected weeks earlier through a program most of them barely understood. Ordinary people, a retired firefighter, a school teacher, a young man who used to play competitive sports before an injury ended his career. Nobody special, nobody chosen for aggression, because nobody expected to find any. I remember watching the first volunteer step into the scanning chamber. Her name was Priya, and she looked nervous the way anyone looks nervous walking into unfamiliar alien machinery. The chamber does not hurt, it reads. Genetic markers, neurological threat responses, stress reactions under controlled simulation. It builds a signature the same way a fingerprint builds an identity. The technician beside me, Io, tapped the console and waited for numbers to populate the screen. They did not populate the way they were supposed to. At first, everyone assumed the equipment had malfunctioned. That happens sometimes with new species. Biology reacts in unexpected ways to unfamiliar scanning frequencies. Io ran a diagnostic. The diagnostic came back clean. She ran the scan again. Same result. Where every species before us had produced one dominant signature, the human results showed three distinct, overlapping patterns, layered on top of each other like separate songs playing at the same time. Io turned to look at me, her small round eyes wide behind her lenses, and asked a question that the translator box rendered in a flat, confused tone. "Is this normal for your species?" I did not know how to answer her, because I did not know either. The two bureau officials from the insect species began speaking rapidly to each other in their own language, too fast for the translator to keep up cleanly. I caught fragments, words like anomaly, words like reassess, words like contain. That last word made my skin go cold. Korath stepped closer to the screen, studying the three overlapping patterns with an expression I could not read. Warborn faces are not built the way ours are. Their expressions live mostly in posture and stance, rather than in the small muscles around the eyes and mouth that humans rely on. But something in the way his shoulders shifted told me he was not simply curious. He was unsettled. Threk Von said nothing at all. He simply watched the screen, and then he watched me, and for a moment I felt like the two of us were the only ones in the room who understood that something had just changed, even if neither of us yet understood what. More volunteers went through the chamber over the next hour. The firefighter, the school teacher, the young man with the sports injury. Every single one of them produced the same three-signature pattern. Different strengths in each one, different balances depending on the person, but always three, always overlapping, always present. By the fourth volunteer, the room had gone almost completely silent, except for the quiet hum of the scanning chamber and the occasional clipped exchange between the bureau officials. I remember standing there, arms crossed, trying to look calm while my mind ran through every possible explanation. Equipment error, contamination, some quirk of human biology that meant nothing at all. I wanted an explanation that would let everyone relax, let the officials stop looking at me like I was hiding something, let Threk Von stop watching me with that unreadable patience of his. None of the explanations held up. The equipment was fine. The samples were clean. Whatever this was, it was real, and it belonged to us. One of the insect officials, the taller of the two, finally turned to address me directly. Her voice through the translator was clipped and formal. "Dr. Bennett, you are the ranking human representative present. Can you explain this data?" I remember the exact way my throat tightened before I answered. I was not a senior scientist. I was not chosen for this moment because I had special insight into human genetics. I was chosen because I happened to be the one junior researcher assigned to babysit the Bureau's paperwork that week. And now every eye in the room, human and otherwise, was waiting for me to make sense of something none of us had ever seen before. I told her the truth, because it was the only thing I had. "I don't know yet," I said, "but I intend to find out." It was not a satisfying answer. I could see that in the stiff way she folded her upper limbs. But it was honest, and honesty was all I had to offer in that moment. Threk Von spoke then, for the first time since the results appeared. His voice was low, carrying the particular weight that Warborn speech always seems to have, like every word had been considered before it left his mouth. "Three signatures," he said, "is not a flaw in your species. It is a language we do not yet know how to read." Nobody responded to that right away. The Bureau officials exchanged another rapid burst of dialogue. Korath continued staring at the screen like he was trying to memorize it, and I stood there, caught between two species that suddenly seemed far more interested in humanity than they had been an hour earlier. I thought about the joke everyone had been telling for the past 2 days, about humans arguing over lunch, about how harmless and disorganized we supposedly were. I thought about how easy it had been to laugh along with it. Nobody was laughing now. The meeting ended shortly after, though ended is a generous word for what actually happened. The officials retreated to consult with higher authorities. Io began pulling every scrap of raw data for closer analysis. Korath left without a word, moving with the particular stiffness of someone whose entire understanding of the universe had just been challenged. Threk Von lingered. He waited until the room had mostly emptied before he approached me again, and this time his voice dropped lower, meant only for me to hear. "I warned you this morning," he said. "I did not know then what the trials would find. I only knew that they always find something." I asked him what he meant. He looked at the screen one more time, at those 3 overlapping patterns still glowing there, silent and strange. "Every species that reaches this point in its history believes it understands itself," he said. "The trials exist because belief and truth are rarely the same thing." Then he left, and I was alone in that room with a screen full of answers that only raised more questions, and a growing sense that whatever came next was going to be far bigger than paperwork. I did not sleep well that night. I kept replaying those 3 overlapping signatures in my mind, wondering what they meant, wondering why my own species had never noticed we carried something so strange inside us. Humanity had spent centuries studying its own biology, mapping its own genome, cataloging every disease and disorder we could find. And somehow, we had missed this. Somewhere out among the stars, alien scientists were now studying the results of an ordinary trial and finding something that did not fit any pattern they had ever recorded. Somewhere, a species built entirely around one perfect form of combat was looking at a species that had never needed to choose just one. I did not know yet how deep the difference went. I did not know it would reshape how the entire galaxy saw us, or how close it would come to changing everything humanity had just been given. All I knew, standing in that quiet room with the glow of the screen still reflected in my eyes, was that the joke about humans and lunch would never be told again. Something had woken up inside our biology, and it was only the beginning. The message came through at 4 in the morning, and I knew before I even opened it that sleep was over for the night. Director Martin Blake wanted every human volunteer back in the trial chamber within 6 hours, along with a full explanation of what the previous day's results actually meant. The problem was simple. Nobody had that explanation yet, including me, and I was the one being asked to produce it. I arrived at the facility to find the halls already busy in a way they never were this early. Researchers moved quickly between labs, carrying data slates instead of coffee. Io had not left the building at all. She sat at her console with the same 3 overlapping signatures from the day before, still glowing on her screen, now surrounded by dozens of smaller charts she had generated overnight, while trying to make sense of the pattern. She looked up when I walked in, her small round eyes tired behind her lenses. "I found something," she said, and her voice through the translator carried an edge of nervous excitement. "I do not think you will like it." She pulled up a comparison chart showing the Warborn baseline signature beside the human data. The Warborn line was clean, a single sharp curve that rose and fell in one smooth motion. The human data looked completely different. 3 separate curves, each with its own shape, its own triggers, its own rhythm, weaving around each other like threads in a rope. I asked her what it meant, and she admitted she did not fully know yet, but she had a theory, and she wanted to test it properly before presenting anything to the Bureau officials. Her theory involved running the baseline test again, this time under more controlled conditions, with sensors measuring not just the genetic markers, but the exact moment each signature activated during simulated stress. If we could catch the signatures firing individually instead of all at once, we might finally understand what triggered each one. I agreed, mostly because I had no better idea, and because the alternative was walking into a room full of anxious officials with nothing but confusion to offer them. We needed volunteers who could handle a longer, more demanding session, so I made calls while Io prepared the equipment. Among the people who answered was Daniel Ford, the young man with the sports injury from the first round of testing. He agreed to come back without hesitation, which surprised me a little given how strange the previous day must have felt for him. When he arrived, he looked tired but calm, the kind of calm that comes from someone who has already decided not to worry about things outside his control. I told him honestly that we did not fully understand what we were looking for, only that we needed to observe his responses more closely than before. He nodded and said something that stuck with me for the rest of the day. "If it helps people understand something true about us," he said, "then it is worth doing properly. The new testing protocol took most of the morning to prepare. EO built 3 separate simulation stages, each designed to trigger a different kind of stress response. The first stage presented a slow, building threat, something distant and approaching, meant to measure a calm, calculating reaction. The second stage introduced a sudden danger aimed at something the volunteer cared about, a simulated scenario involving a vulnerable figure needing protection. The third stage removed the physical threat entirely and instead presented a complex problem requiring quick strategic thinking under pressure, with consequences attached to failure. Daniel Ford went first, stepping into the scanning chamber while EO and I watched from the console outside. During the first stage, his readings shifted slowly, a gradual rise in focus and controlled awareness. His heart rate increased in a steady, measured way, and his attention narrowed, almost like a hunter tracking something far off in the distance. EO marked this as the first signature. She called it the patient signature because it did not rush. It watched, calculated, and waited for the right moment. Then the second stage began, and everything changed instantly. The simulated scenario placed a vulnerable figure directly in the path of sudden danger, and Daniel's reading spiked so sharply that EO actually flinched at her console. His heart rate jumped, his focus became almost tunnel-like, and every marker on the screen surged upward at once. This was nothing like the first signature. This was immediate, overwhelming, and fiercely protective. EO labeled this the Guardian signature, and even through the clinical language of her notes, I could tell she was unsettled by how powerful the spike had been. The third stage tested something entirely different. No danger, no threat to protect, just a complicated problem with a ticking clock and real consequences for failure. Daniel's readings here were calm again, but not in the same way as the first stage. This calm was colder, sharper, almost mechanical in its precision. His mind clearly shifted into a mode built purely for solving problems efficiently, without emotion clouding the process. EO called this the strategist's signature. 3 tests, 3 completely different responses, 3 signatures, each distinct, each activating under its own specific conditions, yet all belonging to the same person. When Daniel stepped out of the chamber, he looked exhausted but curious, asking immediately what we had found. I explained it to him as simply as I could, and he listened carefully before nodding slowly. "That actually makes sense," he said. "When my accident happened years ago, I remember feeling exactly like that, calm at first, watching what was happening. Then something took over completely when I saw someone else in danger nearby. And afterward, when everything calmed down, my mind switched into figuring out what to do next without any of the fear left in it." His description matched the data almost perfectly, and hearing it from someone who had lived through it made the numbers on the screen feel suddenly real in a way they had not before. We repeated the same 3-stage test with several more volunteers throughout the day, and the pattern held every single time. The exact balance between the 3 signatures varied slightly from person to person, some leaning more toward the patient signature, others toward the guardian, still others toward the strategist. But every human volunteer carried all 3, always distinct, always ready to activate under the right conditions. By early afternoon, EO and I had enough data to bring to the Bureau officials, though neither of us felt fully prepared for how they would react. The meeting took place in a larger conference room this time, filled with more officials than before. Word of the anomaly had clearly spread beyond our small testing group. Threk Vaughn and Korath were present again, standing near the back of the room, along with several other Warborn officers I did not recognize. Their presence alone told me how seriously their command was taking this. I presented the findings as clearly as I could, walking through each of the 3 stages and the corresponding signature they revealed. I explained the patient's signature, the calculating awareness that builds slowly and waits for the right moment. I explained the guardian's signature, the overwhelming surge triggered specifically by threats to others rather than to oneself. And I explained the strategist's signature, the cold, efficient problem-solving mode that activates once danger becomes something to be managed rather than reacted to. The room stayed silent through most of my presentation, though I could see reactions rippling through the officials as the pieces came together. One of the insect officials asked whether this meant humans could somehow choose which signature to use in any given moment, or whether the switching happened automatically based on circumstances. I admitted honestly that we did not yet know the full answer, but the data suggested it was closer to automatic, shaped by the specific nature of the threat rather than conscious choice. A distant, building danger triggered patience. A direct threat to someone vulnerable triggered protection. A complex problem without immediate danger triggered strategy. Another official asked the question I had been dreading since the previous night. She wanted to know whether this made humanity more dangerous than previously assessed, and whether the Bureau needed to reconsider the terms of our provisional membership. Before I could answer, Threk Von spoke from the back of the room, his voice carrying easily despite its quiet tone. "Danger is not measured only by strength," he said. "It is measured by purpose. A single blade is dangerous because it is sharp. 3 blades folded into one hand are dangerous only if the hand chooses to use them, and more interesting still, if the hand knows exactly which blade to draw for which task." His words did not fully answer the official's question, but they shifted the tone of the room slightly, away from fear and toward something closer to careful curiosity. Korath, standing beside him, finally spoke as well, and his voice carried none of Threk Von's calm patience. His tone was sharper, almost challenging. "Our people have spent generations perfecting one form of combat readiness," he said. "If this data is accurate, these humans possess 3 forms without generations of breeding behind them. I want to know how that is possible." Nobody in the room had an answer to that question, including me. Evolution does not usually hand a species 3 separate combat responses without a very long, very specific history shaping them that way. Humanity had not been bred for war the way the Warborn had. If anything, our history was full of long periods where survival depended more on cooperation than combat. And yet here was the data, undeniable, repeatable, present in every volunteer we tested. I told the room honestly that I believed the origin of these 3 signatures deserved deeper research, separate from the immediate question of how the Bureau chose to classify humanity moving forward. Understanding why we carried this trait felt just as important as understanding what it meant politically. Director Blake, who had remained quiet through most of the meeting, finally spoke up near the end. He thanked me for the clarity of the presentation and announced that a formal review board would convene within the next 2 days to determine what this discovery meant for humanity's Concord status. The meeting ended shortly after, but the tension in the room did not fade the way it had the day before. If anything, it deepened, spreading outward into whispered conversations among officials as they filed out. Threk Von approached me once more before leaving, and this time his expression carried something new, something closer to genuine curiosity than caution. "Dr. Bennett," he said, "I would like to understand this further, away from the noise of committees and review boards. Would you be willing to speak with me privately?" I agreed without hesitation, partly because I sensed he might offer insight the Bureau's official channels never would, and partly because something about his tone told me this conversation mattered more than any formal review could. As I gathered my notes to leave that evening, I found myself thinking about Daniel Ford's words from earlier in the day, about how the data matched exactly what he remembered feeling during the worst moment of his life. 3 signatures, 3 responses, each one arriving precisely when it was needed most. I did not yet understand why humanity carried this trait, or what it meant for our place among the stars, but I understood, standing there in the quiet aftermath of that meeting, that whatever explanation we eventually found would change far more than a chart on a screen. It would change how every species in this galaxy looked at us, and perhaps how we looked at ourselves. Threk Von asked me to meet him in a quiet observation deck on the upper level of the facility, away from the labs and the committee rooms where everyone else was busy arguing about what to do with humanity's future. The deck overlooked a wide viewport showing the stars outside, and when I arrived, he was already standing there, still, watching the darkness with the kind of patience that seemed built into every Warborn I had met so far. He did not turn around immediately when I entered, and for a moment neither of us spoke. I remember standing there, unsure whether to break the silence, until he finally addressed me without moving. "Dr. Bennett," he said, "do you know how my people came to be the way we are?" I admitted that I only knew the general history taught through bureau records, that centuries ago his ancestors chose to shape themselves deliberately toward one purpose, and that the Warborn had maintained that focus ever since. He turned to face me then, and something in his expression seemed heavier than before. "We did not always fight the way we do now," he said. "Long before the shaping began, our ancestors faced extinction. Our world held too many predators, too many enemies, too little time to adapt slowly the way most species do. So we made a choice. We selected for one trait above all others, generation after generation, until it became who we are. Focus, precision, a single purpose, refined without distraction." I asked him whether he ever wondered what his people might have become if they had chosen differently. He was quiet for a long moment before answering. "Every Warborn wonders that at some point," he said, "but we cannot know, because the choice narrowed everything else away. We became perfect at one thing by giving up the possibility of becoming anything else." He gestured toward the stars beyond the viewport, and his voice grew quieter still. "Your species did not make that choice," he said, "and yet you carry 3 signatures where every other species we have ever measured carries 1. I want to understand why, because I believe the answer says something important about what kind of danger you truly represent, if you represent one at all." I told him honestly that humanity's own scientists were only beginning to investigate the same question, and that I did not yet have a complete answer. But I shared with him what our historical records suggested, pieced together from long before space travel, long before we ever imagined meeting another species among the stars. Humanity's early history was shaped by 3 very different kinds of survival pressure, layered across thousands of years rather than any single deliberate breeding program. Long ago, our ancestors survived as hunters, tracking prey across vast distances with patience and calculated awareness, always watching, always waiting for the right moment to act. That pressure shaped one part of our biology, the patient signature Io had identified in the trials. At the same time, our ancestors lived in small groups where protecting children, elders, and each other from sudden danger meant the difference between a community surviving or vanishing entirely. That pressure shaped a second, entirely different response, immediate and overwhelming, triggered specifically by threats to others rather than to oneself. This became the guardian signature. And later, as our species began building tools, forming complex societies, and facing dangers that could not be solved through instinct alone, a third pressure emerged, one built around solving problems quickly and efficiently under pressure, without needing raw emotion to drive the response. This became the strategist's signature. 3 separate pressures, arriving at different points across a very long history, each shaping its own distinct response, rather than one pressure narrowing everything into a single focused trait. Threk Von listened carefully, and when I finished, he was quiet again, considering what I had said. "Your history did not simplify you," he said finally. "It layered you instead." I told him I believed that might be exactly right, though I admitted the theory still needed far more research before anyone could call it certain. He nodded slowly, and for the first time since I had met him, something in his posture softened slightly, the careful formality easing into something closer to genuine reflection. "My people respect strength that is simple to understand," he said. "A single blade, sharpened without distraction, has always made sense to us. 3 signatures folded into one being does not fit easily into that understanding. It unsettles many among my command, because they do not know how to measure something that changes shape depending on the moment." I asked him honestly whether he found it unsettling as well. He considered the question longer than I expected before answering. "I find it more interesting than unsettling," he said. "A blade that is always sharp in the same way can be studied, predicted, and eventually countered. A blade that changes its edge depending on what it faces is far harder to prepare for. That alone makes your species worth understanding carefully, rather than dismissing quickly the way many among the Bureau initially did. Our conversation continued for a long while after that, moving beyond the immediate data and into broader questions about what this discovery meant for the future. Threk Von asked whether humanity's leaders intended to use this trait deliberately, perhaps training soldiers to draw on one signature over another, depending on circumstances. I told him honestly that no such program existed yet, and that most of humanity did not even know this discovery had been made. He found that surprising, and said so directly. "If my people discovered such a trait within ourselves," he said, "our command would move immediately to understand and shape it for advantage. Your species discovers something this significant, and your response so far has been careful research rather than immediate application." I told him that perhaps that difference said something important as well, that humanity's instinct in this moment was to understand before acting rather than to weaponize immediately. He considered this for a long moment before responding. "Or perhaps," he said, "your species has not yet decided what this discovery means for yourselves, and caution is simply the shape that indecision takes for now." It was a fair point, and one I did not have a strong answer to. The truth was that humanity, as a whole, had barely begun processing what these three signatures represented. Some among the Bureau feared it meant we were more dangerous than previously assessed. Others, like Threk Von, seemed to view it as something worth understanding rather than fearing outright. And back home, most people had no idea this conversation was even happening. Before our meeting ended, Threk Von raised something that surprised me, a question that suggested his interest went beyond simple curiosity. "Korath believes this discovery threatens the standing of Warborn combat superiority within the Concord," he said. "He has requested a formal demonstration, a controlled trial between one of our own and a human volunteer, to determine whether this triple signature translates into meaningful advantage, or whether it remains simply an interesting curiosity without practical consequence." I felt my stomach tighten at the idea. A formal trial between a Warborn and a human volunteer sounded less like scientific curiosity and more like exactly the kind of confrontation everyone should have been trying to avoid. I asked him whether such a demonstration was truly necessary, given how much uncertainty still surrounded the discovery. "Necessary is not the right word," he said, "but Korath is not alone in his request. Several among Warborn Command share his position, believing that data alone cannot settle a question this significant. They wish to see it demonstrated directly, under controlled and monitored conditions, with safety measures in place to prevent serious harm to either participant." I asked what would happen if the Bureau refused such a request. Threk Von's answer was careful, measured in the way I was beginning to recognize as characteristic of how he approached difficult truths. "Refusal would not stop the question," he said. "It would only delay the answer, and delay breeds suspicion. Better, I believe, to allow a controlled demonstration under proper oversight than to leave this question unanswered, festering into something far less controlled later." I understood his reasoning, even as it worried me deeply. A formal trial meant real people stepping into real danger, however controlled the conditions claimed to be. It meant Daniel Ford, or someone like him, facing a Warborn champion directly, with every alien in the Concord watching to see what happened. I told Threk Von honestly that I needed time to think through the implications before agreeing to support such a proposal within the Bureau's review process. He nodded, seeming to expect exactly that response. "Take the time you need," he said. "But know that Korath will not wait long. He believes strongly in his position, and others within our command are beginning to share his impatience." Our conversation ended shortly after, and I left the observation deck with far more questions than I had arrived with. Walking back through the quiet corridors of the facility, I found myself thinking about everything Threk Von had shared, about the long history that shaped his people into a single sharpened purpose, and the very different history that had layered humanity into something far less predictable. I thought about Daniel Ford's description of his own experience, matching the data so precisely, patient awareness giving way to overwhelming protection, then settling into cold, clear strategy once the immediate danger passed. 3 signatures, arriving exactly when needed, shaped not by deliberate breeding, but by thousands of years of layered survival pressure. I thought about Korath's sharp, challenging tone, and the growing impatience Threk Von had described among Warborn command. A formal trial felt less like a scientific curiosity now, and more like an inevitability, something that would happen regardless of how the Bureau's review board eventually voted. The following morning, Director Blake called an emergency session, and I learned that Korath's request had already reached the highest levels of Warborn command, along with formal correspondence requesting the Bureau's cooperation in arranging a controlled demonstration trial. The review board debated the proposal for hours, weighing the risks against the potential benefits of settling the question definitively rather than allowing speculation to spread unchecked across the Concord. Some officials argued strongly against any physical demonstration, insisting that the genetic data alone should be sufficient for classification purposes. Others argued that Warborn Command's request could not simply be dismissed without risking a far more serious diplomatic breakdown. I was asked directly for my recommendation, given my role in uncovering the original discovery. I told the board honestly that I understood the risks involved, but that Threk Von's reasoning had merit. Refusing the demonstration would not eliminate the underlying tension. It would only delay a confrontation that seemed increasingly likely to happen, regardless of the Bureau's official position. After much deliberation, the review board reached a decision. A controlled demonstration trial would proceed, under strict safety protocols, monitored by both Bureau officials and medical personnel from both species, with clear limits established to prevent serious harm to either participant. Daniel Ford was contacted that same afternoon and asked whether he would be willing to represent humanity in the demonstration. I remember the call vividly, listening as Director Blake explained the situation carefully, emphasizing that participation remained entirely voluntary and that no one would think less of him for declining. Daniel's response came without hesitation. "If people need to understand what we truly are," he said, "then I want to be the one who shows them, rather than leaving that question to someone who might not fully understand what is at stake." The demonstration was scheduled for 2 days later, in a secured combat arena designed specifically for controlled trials between different species. Word spread quickly through the facility, and I could feel the tension building with each passing hour, not just between humans and Warborn, but throughout the entire Bureau, as representatives from dozens of Concord species prepared to witness something that would likely determine how the galaxy viewed humanity for generations to come. I spent much of the following 2 days working closely with Daniel, helping him understand what little we knew about how his 3 signatures might activate under real pressure, while medical staff monitored his readiness and safety protocols were finalized for the arena itself. Threk Von found me once more during that preparation period, his expression carrying something between concern and quiet respect. "Whatever happens in that arena," he said, "know that this demonstration was never meant to determine whether your species deserves respect. It was meant only to help us understand the shape of a strength we do not yet fully comprehend." I told him I hoped he was right, and that whatever the outcome, I hoped it would bring clarity rather than deeper division between our peoples. He nodded slowly, and before leaving, he added one final thought that stayed with me through the tense hours leading up to the demonstration itself. "Korath is a skilled and disciplined warrior," he said, "but discipline built around a single purpose sometimes struggles to anticipate what it has never needed to consider before. Whatever happens tomorrow, I believe we are all about to learn something none of us fully expected." The arena felt colder than I expected when I walked in that morning, though I suspected the chill had less to do with the temperature and more to do with the hundreds of eyes already gathered along the observation gallery above. Representatives from across the Concord had arrived overnight, filling seats that overlooked a wide, circular floor marked with sensor lines and monitoring equipment. Medical teams from both species stood ready at opposite ends of the arena, along with a full contingent of safety officials whose only job that day was to stop the demonstration the moment anyone's readings crossed into dangerous territory. Daniel Ford stood near the human medical team, dressed in a fitted monitoring suit that tracked his vital signs and neurological activity in real time. He looked calm, though I noticed the slight tension in his shoulders that told me the weight of the moment had not escaped him. Across the arena, Korath prepared as well, moving through a series of controlled stretches with the kind of discipline that comes from a lifetime spent training for exactly this kind of moment. His readiness suit displayed Warborn biological markers on a separate monitor, ready to be compared directly against Daniel's readings once the demonstration began. I found a place near the central console beside Io, who had been given full authority to monitor and record every data point generated during the trial. Threk Van stood nearby as well, arms folded, watching the arena floor with the same quiet patience I had come to expect from him. Director Blake addressed the gathered representatives briefly before the demonstration began, reminding everyone present that this was a controlled scientific exercise, not a contest of superiority between species. Safety protocols were reviewed one final time, and both participants confirmed their readiness to proceed. The signal came, and the demonstration began. Korath moved first, closing the distance between himself and Daniel with the precise, economical motion of someone who had trained his entire life toward this single purpose. His approach was measured, calculated, exactly the kind of controlled aggression the Warborn baseline signature had predicted from the very first day of testing. I watched Daniel's monitor as the confrontation unfolded, and the first signature activated almost immediately, the patient signature Io had identified during our earlier testing. His readings showed careful, controlled awareness, tracking Korath's movement without panic, watching for an opening rather than reacting immediately to the approaching pressure. For several long moments, the two of them circled the arena floor, each testing the other's readiness without committing fully to any single approach. Korath's single signature remained steady throughout, sharp and consistent, exactly as trained. Daniel's patient signature held as well, calm and calculating, absorbing information rather than rushing toward a response. Then the demonstration shifted unexpectedly. As part of the controlled scenario, a secondary element had been introduced into the arena, a simulated presence representing a vulnerable figure positioned near the edge of the sensor field, meant to test how each participant's biology responded when protective instincts came into play rather than pure individual combat readiness. The moment the simulated threat moved toward that vulnerable figure, Daniel's readings spiked with a suddenness that made even the experienced medical staff around me tense visibly. The Guardian signature activated instantly, overwhelming in its intensity, and his entire posture shifted from careful patience into something far more immediate and forceful. Korath, trained for a single, consistent form of combat readiness, seemed momentarily uncertain how to interpret the sudden shift in his opponent's behavior. His own signature remained steady, but steady in this moment meant predictable, and predictability became a disadvantage against an opponent whose response had just changed shape entirely. Daniel closed the distance quickly, his movements no longer patient but urgent, focused entirely on neutralizing the threat to the vulnerable figure rather than engaging Korath directly for its own sake. The two of them exchanged a brief, controlled sequence of movements, monitored closely by the safety officials, standing ready to intervene the moment anything crossed established limits. Korath adapted as best he could, relying on the precision his people had spent generations perfecting, but I could see even from the observation console that something in his approach had begun to falter, unable to fully anticipate a response that shifted so dramatically, depending on what was actually at stake in the moment. The simulated threat was neutralized within the safety protocols established for the demonstration, and almost immediately, Daniel's readings shifted again, the overwhelming Guardian signature settling back down as the immediate danger passed. What replaced it was neither the earlier patience nor the intense protective surge, but something colder and more calculated, the strategist signature Io had identified during our third testing stage. With the immediate danger resolved, Daniel's focus shifted entirely toward efficiently concluding the demonstration according to the established safety parameters, moving with clear, deliberate precision rather than raw emotion. Korath, still adjusting to the sudden shifts he had just witnessed, found himself facing an opponent whose approach had transformed 3 times within a matter of minutes, each transformation arriving precisely when the circumstances called for it. The safety officials called the demonstration to a controlled conclusion shortly after, both participants stepping back as medical teams moved in to confirm their condition. Neither Daniel nor Korath had sustained any serious harm, exactly as the safety protocols had been designed to ensure, but the data captured throughout the demonstration told a story far more significant than any physical outcome could have. Korath stood still for a long moment after the demonstration ended, his breathing controlled but his posture carrying something I had not seen from him before, a kind of thoughtful stillness that replaced his earlier restless energy. He walked slowly across the arena floor toward Daniel, and the entire gallery seemed to hold its breath, uncertain what to expect from the encounter. When Korath finally spoke, his voice carried none of the sharp challenge I had heard from him during our earlier meetings. "I have trained my entire life to recognize a single form of readiness," he said. "I did not anticipate an opponent who could shift the shape of that readiness depending on what the moment required." Daniel, still catching his breath, responded honestly. "I did not choose to shift," he said. "It simply happened, the way it always has, whenever something like this has mattered." Korath considered this for a long moment before responding again. "That may be the most unsettling part of what I witnessed today," he said. "My people perfected discipline through generations of deliberate choice. Your species seems to carry this without needing to choose it at all." He extended his arm then, in a gesture I recognized from bureau briefings as a formal sign of respect among Warborn culture, reserved typically for opponents who had proven themselves worthy through direct confrontation. Daniel accepted the gesture, and the two of them stood there for a moment, watched by hundreds of representatives from across the Concord, in what felt less like the end of a demonstration and more like the beginning of something neither species had fully anticipated. Threk Vaughn approached me as the arena slowly began to clear, his expression carrying the same quiet satisfaction I imagined a teacher might feel watching a difficult lesson finally land correctly. "Korath believed strength could only be measured through consistency," he said. "Today he learned that consistency is only one path toward strength, and perhaps not the only one worth respecting." I asked him what he believed the demonstration meant for humanity's standing moving forward, given how dramatically the results had unfolded. He considered the question carefully before answering. "I believe it means the review board will need to reconsider their entire framework for classification," he said. "Your species does not fit neatly into a single signature the way every other species we have measured does. That does not necessarily make you more dangerous, Dr. Bennett. It makes you far more difficult to categorize using the tools we have always relied upon." I found Daniel afterward, still recovering near the medical team, and asked him how he felt about everything that had just happened in front of so many watching eyes. He considered the question for a moment before responding, and his answer stayed with me long after that day ended. "I did not feel like I was fighting for humanity out there," he said. "I felt like I was just doing what needed to be done, the same way I imagine anyone would, if someone they cared about needed protecting and then needed a clear way forward once the danger passed." His words captured something I had been struggling to articulate ever since the very first anomalous results appeared on EO's screen days earlier. Humanity's 3 signatures were not simply a tool for combat advantage, measured and weaponized the way Korath and his command had initially feared. They were something deeper, shaped by countless generations of survival that demanded patience, protection, and clear thinking, arriving precisely when each was needed most, without requiring deliberate choice in the moment itself. As the arena emptied and the representatives from across the Concord dispersed to file their own reports and reactions, I found myself standing near the center of the now quiet floor, thinking about how dramatically the past several days had reshaped everything I thought I understood about my own species. We had walked into this trial expecting confirmation of humanity's assumed place near the bottom of the Concord's understanding of combat readiness. Instead, we had revealed something that even the oldest, most disciplined fighting culture in known space had never encountered before, a form of strength built not around narrow perfection, but around the ability to become exactly what a moment required, again and again, without needing generations of deliberate breeding to make it possible. I did not yet know how the formal review board would ultimately classify humanity following this demonstration, or how the wider Concord would respond to data this unprecedented. But standing there in that quiet arena, watching Daniel, Ford, and Korath exchange a final respectful nod before parting ways, I understood that whatever came next, humanity's place among the stars had just changed in a way none of us could have predicted only a few short days earlier. The formal review board convened 3 days after the demonstration, and this time the room was filled beyond capacity, with representatives from nearly every species holding a seat within the Concord, crowding into a chamber built to hold far fewer. I sat near the front alongside EO and Daniel Ford, waiting as Director Blake called the session to order. The atmosphere felt different from the tense uncertainty of our earlier meetings. This was no longer confusion over strange data. This was a room preparing to make a decision that would shape how the entire galaxy understood humanity moving forward. The insect official who had first questioned me days earlier stood to present the board's summary of findings, and I listened carefully as she walked through everything that had unfolded since EO's initial discovery. She described the 3 distinct signatures in careful, measured language, the patient awareness that builds slowly, the overwhelming protective surge triggered specifically by threats to others, and the cold, efficient strategy that emerges once danger shifts from immediate to manageable. She then described the demonstration itself, presenting the recorded data from Daniel and Korath's encounter without embellishment, letting the numbers speak plainly about how dramatically Daniel's biology had shifted shape 3 times within a matter of minutes, each shift arriving precisely when circumstances called for it. When she finished, she turned to address the room directly, and her next words carried the weight of a decision already reached. "The board has concluded," she said, "that the existing classification framework, built entirely around measuring a single dominant aggression signature, is insufficient for accurately assessing a species such as humanity. We recommend the creation of a new classification category, one that accounts for adaptive, layered biological response rather than singular focused readiness." A ripple of quiet conversation moved through the gathered representatives, and I felt Daniel shift slightly beside me, absorbing what this meant, alongside everyone else in the room. The official continued, explaining that this new classification would not label humanity as inherently more dangerous than other Concord species, but rather as unpredictable in a way the existing framework had never needed to consider before. "Danger," she explained, echoing something remarkably close to what Threk Vaughn had told me days earlier, was not simply a matter of raw capability, but of purpose and circumstance. Humanity's guardian signature, she noted, activated specifically in response to threats against others rather than personal danger alone, suggesting that whatever strength this trait represented was fundamentally tied to protection rather than aggression for its own sake. This detail, she emphasized, had weighed heavily in the board's final recommendation. Threk Vaughn rose to speak next, representing Warborn Command's official position following the demonstration. The room quieted further as he began, and I found myself holding my breath slightly, uncertain what direction his people's official stance would take after everything that had unfolded. "My people have spent generations perfecting a single form of strength," he said, "and we have long measured other species against that standard, believing consistency to be the truest form of readiness." The demonstration challenged that belief in ways my command did not fully anticipate. He paused, glancing briefly toward where Korath stood near the back of the chamber, before continuing. Korath faced an opponent whose readiness shifted 3 times within the span of a single encounter, always precisely aligned with what the moment demanded. This is not a weakness we can easily counter through our traditional methods, but neither do we believe it represents a threat requiring containment. Warborn Command formally recommends that humanity be granted full standing within the Concord, alongside the creation of joint training initiatives between our peoples, allowing us to better understand this layered form of readiness rather than simply fearing what we do not yet fully comprehend. His recommendation surprised many in the room, myself included, though thinking back on our private conversation on the observation deck days earlier, I realized his position had likely been building since the moment he first watched those 3 signatures appear on EO's screen. The board deliberated further before reaching its final decision, weighing input from dozens of Concord representatives over the following hours. By the end of that long session, humanity's provisional status was formally elevated to full Concord membership, accompanied by the creation of an entirely new classification category, recognizing adaptive, layered biological readiness as a legitimate and respected form of strength within the broader galactic community. The announcement spread quickly beyond the review chamber, reaching human settlements and installations across our small but growing presence among the stars. I remember watching the reactions filter in over the following days, disbelief giving way slowly to a strange kind of quiet pride, as people back home began to understand what the trials had revealed about biology none of us had ever fully recognized in ourselves. In the weeks that followed, I found myself spending considerable time working alongside EO, continuing research into the origins and mechanics of humanity's 3 signatures, now with far greater resources and support from both human and Concord scientific institutions. We began to understand more precisely how each signature connected to specific evolutionary pressures, and how the balance between them varied naturally across different individuals, shaped by both biology and life experience. Daniel Ford became something of an unlikely figure of interest across the Concord following the demonstration, though he handled the attention with the same quiet humility I had come to expect from him. When asked by various officials and researchers to reflect on his experience, his answers remained remarkably consistent with what he had told me on that very first day of testing. "I did not do anything special," he said more than once. "I simply responded the way I imagine anyone would, given what the moment required." Korath, surprisingly, became one of the strongest advocates for the joint training initiatives Threk Von had proposed, spending considerable time studying alongside human volunteers to better understand the layered nature of our biological responses. His initial challenge, born from a sense of threatened superiority, had transformed into genuine scientific curiosity, and more than once I overheard him discussing strategy with Daniel, as though the tension of their earlier encounter had never existed. Threk Von and I continued our own conversations as well, meeting occasionally on that same quiet observation deck where we had first discussed the deeper history behind humanity's 3 signatures. During one such meeting, months after the review board's decision, he shared a reflection that stayed with me long afterward. "My people built ourselves toward a single sharpened purpose, because our history demanded a single choice for survival," he said. "Your history demanded no such narrowing. It layered pressure upon pressure across countless generations, and rather than choosing one path, your biology simply carried all 3 forward together." I asked him whether he believed one approach was ultimately stronger than the other, and he considered the question with the same careful patience I had come to associate with him. "I no longer believe strength can be measured along a single scale," he said. "My people are unmatched in consistency, capable of sustained focus few species could rival. Your people carry something different, the capacity to become precisely what circumstances demand, shifting shape without needing to choose consciously in the moment. Neither approach makes the other obsolete. I have come to believe they may complement each other more than either of us initially understood." His words captured something I had been reflecting on privately for weeks by that point. Humanity had entered these trials, expecting to be measured and found lacking, judged against a standard built entirely around a kind of strength we had never possessed and had never needed to develop. Instead, we had revealed something none of the existing frameworks had anticipated, a form of readiness shaped not by narrow perfection, but by the accumulated weight of countless generations surviving through patience, protection, and clear thinking, arriving precisely when each was needed most. The joint training initiatives between our species continued to expand in the months that followed, bringing human volunteers and Warborn officers together in programs designed to study and understand rather than simply compete against one another. What began as a moment of feared confrontation slowly transformed into something closer to genuine partnership, built on mutual respect for strengths neither species had fully appreciated in the other before those trials began. I often think back to that very first morning, standing in a quiet testing room as an alarm blinked red on my console, confused and uncertain what those three overlapping signatures could possibly mean. I did not know then how far that single moment of confusion would eventually carry humanity, reshaping not only how the wider galaxy understood our species, but how we understood ourselves. The Warborn built themselves, across centuries of deliberate choice, toward one perfect way to meet danger, refined and sharpened until nothing else remained. Humanity, shaped instead by countless overlapping pressures across a very different history, never had the luxury of narrowing ourselves toward a single path. We simply carried forward everything our survival had ever required: patience and protection and clear thinking, all woven together, ready to become whatever a moment demanded, long before we ever understood why. They built one perfect way to meet danger. We never had to choose just one.